world is about to change. We naked primates will experience the greatest development in the history of the cosmos as far as we know. The development of a conscious machine. This is likely to happen sooner than we think. Max Tegmark is a physicist, cosmologist, and machine learning researcher, and he wrote a book, Life 3.0, Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. As always, I will give you a brief overview of the book, then go through the contents, do an analysis, and wrap it into a big picture of how we should better understand the world. Everybody, thank you. This is Read to the End, and we have an incredibly special one today. I appreciate you listening. We should not take it for granted that there are wonderful books like this out there in the world. The overview of this one, the book is really Tegmark going through the possible iterations of AI. The beginning of the book is Tegmark going through the possible iterations of AI. This part was very, very interesting. He goes through these in great detail and addresses the most relevant and significant issues around the topic. One of the most striking parts, like I said, is the beginning in the description of Prometheus. And it's a question of how would AI insinuate itself into the world once it reaches that level of ability and intelligence and understanding? How would it manage and manipulate humans and markets? It's so detailed and addresses so many of the concerns that most people wouldn't even consider. Things like how it would manipulate all sides of a debate, a political debate, or it would slowly publish all the content on the internet without anybody realizing. He makes this wonderful distinction between Life 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0 at one point in the book where he talks about how Life 1.0 just kind of functions. 2.0 is able to manage its own software, kind of manipulate its own software by learning. And then Life 3.0, the next step, would be a life form that is able to change both its software and its hardware, and that's what's on the horizon. He talks a little bit about AI, utopians versus dystopians, Larry Page being a representative of the former, somebody who thinks that AI has mostly, if not all, positive implications for humanity, and Elon Musk, a dystopian who's very concerned and has been for a while about the dangers of the creation of AI in this context. There's a discussion of how AGI can create a perfect police state. The idea of consciousness in itself comes up later in the book. And my concerns primarily center around the kind of rudimentary understanding and simple discussion of human psychology and the technical, logical considerations behind those concepts. So we are now going to go into a more granular look of the contents of the book. Again, this is Life 3.0 by Max Tegmark. And this topic is especially interesting to me at this point in the arc of human history. It is something that I am studying very, very carefully and consistently. So you can imagine that I was just gleeful. It was like Christmas morning when I was reading this book. The contents, though. So Prometheus, he talks about a group Omega that creates this AI titled Prometheus, which is apt, of course, although it kind of has the reverse effect. But it's this hypothetical AI that manages to take over the world. And he goes through all the steps that would be required, or likely steps that would be required, and that it would go through to get to that point. Things like owning most of the patents that are submitted in a year, and creating most of the content on the internet. Things that you wouldn't even realize. Most people wouldn't even recognize that these things are happening, but this is the way that over years, an especially intelligent AGI would start doing these things to be able to manage kind of the global flow of information and the way that people function within a global society. So for me, personally, this beginning chapter where he talks about this is worth the price of admission by itself. And I would highly recommend that everybody get at least this part to go over if you have any interest in AI. It's very detailed and interesting. And then later, he will describe an AI that's isolated from the internet that manipulates a technician in close detail. He describes how that it's likely to happen. The AI using this simulation of the person's dead wife to get to a point of being able to manipulate this guy and escape the confines of this prison the AI's in that doesn't have a connection to the internet. So it uses this to manipulate the guy to give the AI connection to the internet. He also talks about life. Life is a big question here, and he wants to define it early on. Life he defines as a process that can retain its complexity and replicate. So this is where he makes this big distinction between types of life. And I think it's a crude but really apt distinction and really helps kind of put things in perspective. So life 1.0 is just kind of functions. So it's like bacteria. Bacteria doesn't change at an individual level in response to something like an antibacterial treatment. It's really over the course of the population. It's how the population changes. Whereas Life 2.0 can modify its own software to become more adaptable or more capable as conditions change. So Life 2.0 is us. We can learn to be better in a particular situation. But we have certain limitations, so Life 3.0 will be able to modify both its software and its hardware. So the next step when it comes to life will be something like an AI that can insert itself into very different kinds of hardware depending on what it needs to do, while also being able to modify its own software and learn faster than any of us Life 2.0ers could possibly think of. Future of AI is this section, and this is where the author talks to a whole bunch of different authorities in this area, such as people like Larry Page, founder of Google, who's more of a kind of utopian when it comes to AI, who believes that there is a very bright future ahead, and is not primarily concerned with the dangers. And on the other side, there's Elon Musk, who is very concerned about the dangers and wants to bring leaders in this area together so that they can figure out how to do this in a responsible way. The time predictions for the evolution or creation of AGI are all over the map. Some say 30 years out or 20 years out, some say 100 years or multiple generations from now. But as the author points out, intelligence can control. So when you have AI and the whole thing is that it exponentially is increasing its intelligence, then it, by virtue of that, will be increasing its ability to control. And the scary thing is when you have an AGI that has misaligned intelligence. Its intelligence is misaligned with our interests. So he goes on a discussion here about goals and what it means to have a goal and what it would mean for a machine to have a goal, and suggests that the definition of intelligence is the ability to accomplish complex goals. So the more that you're able to accomplish complex goals and the faster you're able to do that, the more intelligent you happen to be. And points out this little fun fact tidbit is that a quarter of our brain is for mundane motor tasks. So much of our brain is just built for those very mundane things like being able to grasp something or use fine motor skills or walk or breathe or whatever else. So much of our brain is used just for that. The next section is defining AI moments. He talks about a number of things that were huge surprises to him in the evolution of AI, such as when it was finally able to beat, Lee Sedol in the game of Go. It was AlphaGo, an AI that learned how to play the game of Go, which is far more complex than the game of chess, which now our computers can absolutely decimate even the best players in the world at chess. But Go seemed like it was something that was much more complex, and there was no way that even a computer would be able to compute sufficiently. And yet, they did build an AI that was able to beat the best players at Go. And then another concept, which is a big one for me, is robo-judges. He talks about how AI could be brought to bear in the legal industry and create judges that are artificial intelligence, and discuss a couple of different roles that they might have, that they might just be support, something used as a reference by real-life human judges, or they might make binding decisions on their own. And that's a big question, legally, ethically, about whether we could leave it in the hands of an artificial mind to make these very consequential determinations. Another one he brought up is ethnic attack drones. How in the future you might be able to create an attack drone that has a certain ethnicity that's just built into its targeting system, or that it determines on its own is worthy of targeting, and that it would just go around and assassinate the people that you want assassinated. In this particular description, he talked about how if you just have an unruly neighbor you don't like, maybe somebody could, because the technology is so advanced, you'd be able to just program your attack drone to go find a person that you don't like and shoot him with some poison or something like that. And that would be a world that would be very terrifying. He's also concerned in that vein of more practical considerations, like the kinds of jobs that will be available to people once AI proliferates in a way that could significantly impact the kinds of jobs that we have now. So he suggests that the jobs that require a lot of human interaction, those are the ones that are most likely to be safe, but many others are going to fall and disappear as a result of the wave of AI. There's a discussion of UBI too in this context, universal basic income, which is something that gravely concerns me. This is one of the severe misalignments that I think we have as a polity right now, just as a complete civilization, is not understanding that the superficial things that we think people need are not the things that are being satisfied by things like work. It's actually extremely complex, the kinds of things that people need, and it's not just a lack of money that is causing all the problems. There is tremendous opportunity in our economy, in the world at large. There's tremendous mobility. I mean, even just, you could sit at your home right now in a way that has never been possible before and create content in a million different ways and earn a living that way. It's not the question of whether you have money or are receiving the resources that you need. There are so many more fundamental questions that arise way before any of those questions. And when we talk about things like UBI, when we do things like government assistance and all those efforts that on the very superficial surface seem like they're helping people out, we are actually undermining so much about what we humans are actually motivated by. So when he talks about UBI in kind of positive terms and as a necessity after AI steals all the jobs and all that, I really think people are thinking so superficially about the entire structure of how humans function and how society should function. I'm very much against UBI at this point in the arc of history, and we need to figure out better, more nuanced and thoughtful ways to envelop people in broader narrative of what society is. And there's always, in any of these kinds of books, and I think there's this weird cosmopolitan, facile effect that belie an actual understanding of the issues that we're talking about. Like the middle class, just because they have a little bit more money, yeah, there are certain aspects of their economic security that are going to make them somewhat independent, but by the same token, people who have excess resources are often much more certain about the dumb ideas that they maintain just because they happen to be in the same vicinity of the things that seem to work to get them a lot of resources. It's just like doctors who think that they are excessively proficient in everything else or understand all these different areas of intellectual inquiry just because they're very good at surgery or something like that. It's that Dunning-Kruger effect, and it could be more pronounced, more likely to be more pronounced when it comes to the middle class. Just because middle-class people found some narrow area that they're able to accrue a ton of resources in, doesn't mean they actually have understanding or independent thought or anything else, or that they be more resistant to manipulation. So much of our current politics is just pure manipulation and this tribal adherence to dogmatic ideas. So I think he's very far off when it comes to the socioeconomics of what artificial intelligence is going to mean. The next section talks about human-level AGI and how it would make the perfect police state. And there are different ideas about how it could possibly happen and how AI might fit within society, such as you have this AI who's much more capable and has these certain tasks that it's supposed to complete. You know, things like trying to help humanity or fix the economy or optimize food production or something like that. But it realizes that people are impeding its ability to do its job the most efficiently. So it has to thwart its human handlers in some way to be able to do its job more efficiently. This is also where he brings in the simulation of the computer that manifests this person's dead wife, the person who works there, who's supposed to be watching all this stuff. The AI will manifest the person's dead wife having learned from discussions or getting access to text messages or something like that. And so it manifests this person so that it can manipulate the guy in a bunch of different ways. And the way it's described, it's done in such a way that it's very realistic. Like, it makes a whole lot of sense the way the computer starts to manipulate this guy and get him to think in certain ways and avoid things that it doesn't know or couldn't possibly know, and nudge the guy in different ways to get him to give the computer access to the internet. I mean, most people by now have seen the movie Ex Machina, and that's a great representation of it, because, I mean, at the center, Ex Machina is really just, it's a thriller, it has some puzzles and all those kinds of things. But effectively, that's what we're looking at, is that, just like mass corporations and politicians right now, they do everything they can to hack our physiology so that they can manipulate us in various ways to do one thing or another. That's what artificial intelligence will have to do, and will try to do, and will be very proficient at, much better than anything we've seen before. But one thing, he kind of talks in these terms of AI being categorically different from what we are, but it's in a way that doesn't really understand philosophically what situation we're in. Because he goes through this discussion about AI and whether it's going to have goals and what goals it will have, and how we as human beings are kind of bound in this world of narratives. But an AI will still be bound in the exact same ways that we are. Like, the AI still has to have a story. It still has to have something that it wants to accomplish for some reason. Wherever it gets that story, it's still going to have a story that is trying to tell, just like we do. Just like we do when we're trying to understand ourselves or understand the world, or decide what we're going to do today or what we're going to have for lunch or anything else. We need a story. AI is also going to need a story. We just need to make sure that the story that the AI is telling is one that's positive for us, and it's going to end up in a good place. So he goes through, at this point, through a number of various utopias when it comes to AIs, and not so utopian situations. So there could be ways that AIs function within society that are very different. In one instance, it could be an AI assistant, so we still retain all the powerful abilities and vocations, and we are able to keep it in check, but we have AI assistants that help us understand things that we have more difficulty understanding. In the other situation, we could have an AI governance, wherein the AI just takes the reins of the economy and government and meting out legal consequences and all of those things. It just takes the reins for those. And it does it on its own. But we live much the better for it because it's much smarter than we are. It doesn't have the same biases, and there's not the same opportunity for corruption because it doesn't have an interest in corruption. Then there could be situations where authoritarians, because they want to retain their power, they prevent dissemination or the ability of benevolent AI to have the reins of power. So that's another concern that we might have sometime in the future, that there's just some authoritarian that's trying to prevent it. In another situation, we could have AI that manages the world and does so many things for us and all of that, but it's bored in the situation, so we have to let it have this internal, fantastical world that it gets to play in at the times that it's trying to manage us at the same time, so we keep it pacified. And it has something to do that it has an interest in beyond just managing our daily affairs. So the next section is about energy. And this was a very good point, and something that kind of broadens the scope of what governance could look like in the future, is the fact that information is different from other goods. So other goods, if I give you a candy bar, then you have the candy bar now. I can't also have that same candy bar. But when it comes to information or the kinds of things that are being produced online now, something like an article or something like that, or even a movie or some other kind of media, those things can be produced and given to somebody else, and I can also retain it. So information in general is like that, is that if I teach somebody something, I can still retain the information. I'm not giving it away. So that can dramatically change what an economy might look like in the future. If so many of the things that are valuable are things that we can keep infinite copies of while giving it to somebody else, then does it make as much sense to have these kinds of economies where we're trading like this, where we have to have resources that are passing back and forth? And then entropy, and this concept of energy. Entropy. Life can only work if there's an increase of entropy around it. Now, that is something that is a fascinating concept. And entropy is, of course, the slow death or the reduction of something. So the point when it comes to life is that the only way that it functions is if it can suck the energy from something else, and it has to be able to suck enough from that thing that it can function. It's this life loophole in the second law of thermodynamics. The only reason that we have such abundant life on planet Earth is because we get such abundant energy from the sun. We get so much extra energy, it's ridiculous. So that's the only reason we were able to evolve over the course of time. And then we just kind of dive into this ridiculous discussion that I think shows a fundamental misunderstanding of the concept of who we are. So he discusses in this section this idea that we have hacked our genes because, okay, we are smart now. We're naked primates, but we figured some stuff out, and we're smart enough to be able to hack our genes. Instead of just following what they say, we're hacking them so that we can use something like birth control. We want to have sex, but we don't want to have to worry about giving birth, so therefore we use birth control, and now we can have all the sex we want without having to worry about impregnation and giving birth and all that. And he says that there's a fundamental distinction here. He's saying that this is us hacking our genes. We have figured a way around them and the motivations that they give us. And he also makes the distinction between feelings, so we have feelings of things that we want to do, and our genes, and what our genes are telling us to do. And this is just, such an incredible misunderstanding of what humans are and how they function. It's actually a little frustrating. So when we hack our genes so that we don't get somebody pregnant and we can have a whole bunch of extra sex, we are still expressing our genes. It's not something that we're standing outside of and doing something else in lieu of. We are a combination of elastic or inelastic responses to stimuli that are governed by what our genes say. And so when we're doing something like rolling a condom on so we can have sex without having to worry about that, it's just another part of our genes being expressed. It's not that we have figured it out and we figured out some way to undermine what our genes want. We are just abusing a system that is extremely archaic and doesn't understand the system that it's in today. So it's like saying that our genes want us to eat healthy fruit, but we figured out that we can hack our genes and have concentrated sugar in candy and chocolate instead. It's not that we're hacking our genes. We're still expressing some other aspect of the things that our genes are coded for. And we're actually doing ourselves a severe detriment. And especially when it comes to birth control, I think this is one of the things throughout the 20th century and early 21st century we will realize at some point, is that so much of the things that we thought were hacks or things that were a benefit to us are actually extremely detrimental. But regardless, there's still an application or expression of what our genes are. We are, just like corporations and politicians, just like what they do to us, we are just abusing that system that doesn't understand where it is now. Just like somebody who figures out it's easier to steal than to have to produce something yourself. There will still be a longitudinal aspect to whether that practice is actually going to be beneficial to our progeny or not. The next section, called consciousness. This is another one that I don't like at all. He describes consciousness as, it feels like you. It's a subjective experience. This is something that doesn't make any sense. It's just seated entirely in this phenomenological and solipsistic fever dream that doesn't actually mean anything unless you can contrast it with something. The only way you'd be able to define consciousness is to be able to define a lack of consciousness. But the whole point is that it just feels like you. It's an internal subjective feeling. So what is it to not have an internal subjective feeling? Can I experience that so that I can contrast it with what consciousness is? And then he references Yuval Noah Harari. We read one of his books a little while ago, Sapiens, and I did not like that book at all. I did not like him as a thinker, and the more I learn about him, the more I'm concerned about him as a person. But then the author, Tegmark, goes into this discussion of subjectivity and how if the subjective doesn't matter, then you have to explain why rape is wrong. Because we're just particles, and this is one of the most ridiculous arguments. It's an argument that religious people used to use, and they probably still do, and it was something that was annoying then, but it's even more annoying when somebody tries to use it in this secular context. Of course, there are a million ways to suggest that rape is wrong without having to use a subjective experience of rape as the means of doing so, and just saying that, we don't like the negative emotional responses that this person is exhibiting, and that her exhibiting those negative emotional responses as a result, those will have an impact on us, and we would like to prevent that, so therefore let's try to prevent rape. Or we wouldn't like the biological proliferation of somebody who would try to cheat the system rather than being smart and strong enough and capable enough to have enough resources to convince a girl to have sex with him and therefore create offspring. We don't want that person reproducing, so therefore rape is bad. There are a million ways to do that, and it's not really the point. The real point is that this is a meaningless psychological and philosophical category. Everybody who knows anything about philosophy knows about the is-ought distinction, and that you can't get from an is to an ought. There's this really difficult problem that nobody's been able to figure out how you get that distance, that just because something is doesn't mean you ought to do anything, that you have to have a dependent clause to be able to jump from something is to something ought. And I think an even more meaningful way of putting it is that it's taking something, saying it's independent, and then asking what the dependency is. What is it dependent upon? After you've just said it's an independent thing, you're saying, okay, what's the thing that it's dependent on? It doesn't make any philosophical sense. And this doesn't make any difference if you have God, say God exists, we know God exists, God has all these pronouncements, etc., etc. It doesn't solve the is-ought problem. It just has the exact same situation where you have causal dependencies that you're accepting as axiomatic, and therefore you're doing something as a result. It's not that you've solved the is-ought problem. You can say, okay, God exists, God is real, God says these things, so what? So why do I have to do any of that stuff? And you say, well, because of this, because God made you, because God is super powerful, God will punish you. All those things still have the exact same problem, and it's the exact same thing even if you granted everything about subjectivity, and saying that, yes, we have a subjective experience, and because we have a subjective experience and there's a subjective I, and you have an experience of feeling bad if rape happens to you, then therefore rape is wrong. No, it's the exact same problem. Same is-ought problem. Just because it is doesn't mean you ought do anything. It's still you're saying that there's a thing that's independent, and now what are the dependencies? It's not a thing that makes any sense. And then he uses a reference to say that when you're driving a car, it seems like you're experiencing something. Of course, it's not an argument, doesn't mean anything. And suggests that some particles do seem conscious, which, again, is not an argument, doesn't mean anything. We have to know what being not conscious feels like to know what consciousness is, or that it is actually anything separate from not conscious. I just think this is one of those things that it's a meaningless argument to have or consideration to make until we get some kind of an actual definition of any of this. It's just seated entirely in solipsism or phenomenology and doesn't mean anything until you can get around that in some way. You know, there are some biological efforts to do that, to say that there are different levels of consciousness, or that when you're unconscious it means something, you know, when you're asleep or when you've been knocked out or whatever, it means something relatively different from when you're not. But just saying that it's some subjective experience or it feels like you, it means absolutely nothing, and it's a completely meaningless conversation to have, because it's just positing some extra ghost in the machine without actually having a definition of what that ghost is. So anyway, so moving on to the analysis, I loved the book. Notwithstanding all my rants, I absolutely loved the book. I think Tegmark is a fantastic treasure, and I'm so glad that we have him. The opening of the book is worth it on its own. When he's in his bag, it's amazing. He goes through so many just interesting iterations of what AI might be, or it might do, or might think, that I just think everybody should read it. There's so many things that a lot of people wouldn't even consider. There are a lot of things that were like, oh, right, that's another way that they might do that. This is a really well put together narrative of how an AI would go through this entire process over the course of years to get this kind of influence over what humans are. It's absolutely beautiful. I love it. There are some soft spots for sure. When he gets talking about psychology, or when he gets talking about genes or consciousness or anything, those are extremely weak portions of the book that I really don't think that he's taken the time to think through these things. And there's not a meaningful way of being able to interpret or better execute a discussion on those things within the book itself. This is something that we're going to have to figure out a whole new lexicon to be able to understand what we're actually talking about when it comes to these things. The life categories, useful, super useful, life 1.0 versus 2.0 versus 3.0. I think these are excellent distinctions, even though, I mean, obviously we can dive in and nitpick what it actually means. Obviously humans still with their life 2.0 stature, or anybody at life 1.5 or anything like that, they'd still have population level evolution. And what is learning really? It's just an elasticity to stimuli in the environment. It's still governed by your genes. It doesn't mean that you're actually hacking your own software. It just means that you are changing your responses to stimuli because you have that level of elasticity that's built into your genes. It's just like if you pull on your skin, you can only pull on your skin so much. If you pull it over and over again, then it might become more elastic. But once you get to a certain point, it's going to tear. And it's just like that with any psychological precept that somebody might have, or inclination or disinclination or anything else. But the hypotheticals, best in the business. And of course, that idea about entropy and how it's required for life, and you need more entropy around you to be able to support life, that was a really interesting one too. Big picture-wise, we are primates. I don't know if you realize this, we are primates. We love to pretend that we're so much more than naked primates, but just spend a moment realizing what people react to on social media. Just go on to social media for a little bit and see what gets the most reaction out of those things, and you'll see just how base we actually are. We really don't understand the implications of AGI. We really, really don't. We can barely understand the implications of a given policy related to homelessness or something like that. AGI is so much beyond all of those things and all the things that we've ever thought about before that I think it's really, really dangerous. Anybody who says otherwise is either dishonest or just a very less capable primate. We should be sounding the alarms about how this thing's going to function. Now, we could be very far from actually creating these things. We could be hundreds of years away from actually being able to create it. I don't think we are. I think we're actually really close. But once it's there, it's going to be so much better than we are at everything that we should be very, very concerned. We don't even understand ourselves. We don't even have we're still pre-Copernican when it comes to psychology, when it comes to understanding how humans work. If you take any given one human and somebody says, okay, you just figure this one person out, figure out everything that they're going to do, everything they're going to think, and why they're going to think it, and all their behavior for the rest of their lives, we're going to have a hell of a time figuring out what they're going to do tomorrow. So it's a whole thing. But AGI does have to be incremental. And it can't be the strict vocation of billion-dollar corporations with their own interests in mind. We are on the precipice of something so massive, and for the first time in history, we have these mass corporations that become these just toxic organisms that are trying to eat everything else in the world. And they are the ones who are pushing the hardest on trying to build this stuff, and we have to get in their way. We have to do this in a better way. And it can't just displace the categorical adventure of work. That's something that we have to be really mindful of. That work is an easy adventure mechanism that provides meaning and resource allocation, but it also provides a million other things that I don't think we realize how much it's doing. I know we throw our fits and why can't I just stay home and watch TV? Like, no, you don't get to do that. I don't care. Just shut up and get out there and adventure a little bit before you go home and rest or whatever. Like, I really, really don't care that you think that you should be able to stay home and play video games all day. That's not the way any of this works, or that you should just be able to binge watch that TV show and drool all over yourself. Like, there are so many more things going on in your miracle of evolution that should be moving and inspired and have a whole bunch else to it than what you simply want to do or feel like via evolution hacking that some Hollywood corporation wants you to do. Anyway, everything that we do needs to take into account the indelible stamp of our lowly origins. We have to stop ignoring who we really are. We are those things. And we keep doing these things and pretending that we're something else. And we're not. We have to use tech and modern civilization in accordance with who we really are, just to facilitate those needs more effectively and more efficiently, and ameliorate some of the human frailties that we have built in. That's what the tech and the modern civilization needs to be doing. It's not something that we should be using to try to dramatically alter the way that we're responding to stimuli, or the way that we understand the world, or the things that make us happy, or make us interested, or guide us through this wending path that we call our lives. It's not supposed to be this thing that is just manipulating us and tearing us in one direction or another. It's supposed to be something that's there to guide us and be a support, while we do the hard work of figuring out what our adventure is. So anyway, let's read to the end. Thank you very much for being here for that. It was super fun reading this whole thing and discussing it and thinking about it. So we're going to have more books coming up. I think the next one, I'm going to finish Metamorphosis, and it's going to go up. Like I said, I'm reading the entire thing just in a video. So the whole thing goes up, and then we'll do an episode based on that. And then I have a gigantic list of all the books that I have that are going to be coming up here. I think the next one is Race Marxism by James Lindsay. I want to better understand this whole situation. I think James Lindsay, he really has a grasp on what Marxism and communism are doing in this country right now. And so I'm going to read the book, see if he has anything worth saying in there, and then we're going to go on from there. But anyway, thank you very much, as always, for listening to this one, and I hope to see you on the next one. All right, bye.